You have questions? We have answers. Welcome to the Therapist Question Box with your host, Miss Lindsay Schiss.
Welcome back to another episode of the Therapist Question Box. I'm your host, Lindsay Schiss, and today we are going to be talking about boundaries. Boundaries are something that are difficult for many people to understand, and yet they know how important they are. So we are going to break this actually into a two-part series where we can really talk about the nuts and bolts of what are boundaries, why are they important, and then how do we maintain healthy boundaries for ourselves and honor the boundaries of others. Today I have with me Micah Ingalls. Micah, thanks for being with me.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Micah is a therapist at Therapy Utah. And Micah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I have had the privilege of working at Therapy Utah for the last couple of years. I am a licensed marriage family therapist, and I have been doing that for about 10 years now. And I love working with couples, individuals. I really enjoy getting into the deep core trauma work, and a lot of what has led me into getting to do that trauma work and couples work with people is a specialty in treating sexual addiction or unwanted sexual behaviors.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Micah, we are lucky to have you at Therapy Utah. Micah does a lot of our trainings as well. And so Micah is definitely an amazing resource for the other clinicians as well as his clients. So we're really happy to have you on the show today. But today we're going to talk about boundaries. And let's just start with the question, our listener's question, and then we'll jump right into some of the basics around boundaries. So here's the question. Can you share some examples of healthy boundaries that can be set in relationships, and how can we approach our friends if we feel those boundaries are being crossed? Okay, so let's just start again with the basics. What are boundaries? How would you define them? And why are they so essential in healthy relationships?
Yeah, excellent. I mean, this listener is asking a great question because we talk about boundaries all the time, but understanding what they are and getting some concrete examples, I think, is going to be great. So for me, boundaries are ways that we protect our values and protect what we value, right? And it's this ability to define for ourselves where we begin, where we end, and to protect them. And they're crucial to healthy relationships, because if we are enmeshed, if we don't have that clearly defined structure of I'm me and you are you, then the relationship can start serving purposes it's not designed to serve.
Yeah, I love that you said like where I end and they begin. Kind of where that happens is what helps define a boundary, right? It's like with anything. There are boundaries with time. There are boundaries with our finances. There's boundaries, what we can and can't do, right?
Totally.
So
boundaries
it makes
with our
sense.
Space, boundaries with others. Yeah. Makes sense.
Makes sense that we have to do it in our relationships, right?
Yep.
So why do you think boundaries get a bad rap? I have heard people say, oh, so-and-so started going to therapy and now they're big into boundaries and gosh, I hate their therapist. Or, there's frustration around boundaries. Why do you think that is?
I think it's two reasons. One, because boundaries are changing the structure of things, and that's uncomfortable. We don't like change. It means we're doing things differently. And when boundaries are misunderstood, I think they can be easily hijacked.
Tell me about that. What do you mean?
We can use the name boundaries to try to control, manipulate, force, obligate others' behavior, instead of them being about self and our behavior.
I have to tell you, that is something that I learned later in life. I learned that a boundary was about me. It wasn't, I'm going to set a boundary for him or for her that would make me comfortable. No, it was about what is my boundary for me. And I think what you just said is really important, because I actually think they can get hijacked, but I think people don't understand it. I think they think a boundary might be for somebody else as opposed to for them.
Yeah, I agree. Like, we feel powerless at times, and that's when we try to put a boundary in, and we can reclaim power by trying to control others, right? As opposed to reclaiming our power by controlling self.
Yes.
right? And that's a tough lesson to learn.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of what that might look like? Like, what would be a boundary where I am going, you know what, I need to control self more. There's something that's out of alignment with my values, and I need to have a boundary around this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think parenting is one arena where that could come up, or in a couple's relationship. So let's maybe do an example in both.
Okay.
Right? As a parent, I want to be kind to my children, and so they're doing XYZ. I get frustrated, and I try to set a boundary controlling my child as opposed to responding with kindness. And so in that instance, being able to say, instead of telling my child, you will do XYZ, right? Being able to say, okay, I want to respond in kindness here. I want to protect my value here.
So it's really saying, this is how I'm going to show up in this situation.
Yeah.
Like, this is my boundary around this. Even if they're behaving in this way, my boundary is I want to show up as a loving, engaged parent. And so I'm going to have a boundary. When I start to feel like I'm not able to show up that way, what's the boundary? I may stop and go take a break. I may take a walk and come back to the conversation. Would that be a boundary?
Yeah, that's an excellent one, right? What you're going to do in response to a frustrating situation, right? I'm going to step away. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take a breath.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. I love that idea that we are in charge. What that makes me feel like, and I hope our listener with this question can understand, is that we don't have to put control of ourselves and our self-energy into somebody else's hands. It's actually up to us.
Yeah.
Right? That it's all about us, and we get to decide what is and is not okay. Right? I remember Brene Brown said that. She just said, really basic is what is and what is not okay. I thought, oh, that's really basic and easy to remember. This is what's okay with me, and this is what is not. But I'm the one who gets to decide how I show up in this way, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So do you think boundaries look different in romantic relationships versus friendships? Our listener talked about approaching our friends if we feel boundaries are being crossed. Do you think that changes in romantic relationship versus friends?
Essentially, at the core of boundaries, I don't think it does change.
Okay.
A boundary is still defining where we begin and we end, right? It's still setting those limits. It's protecting what's okay, what's not okay. And that's important in a committed relationship, in a romantic relationship, or a friendship. What the boundaries specifically are might be different, right? Because the degree of vulnerability in a romantic relationship is going to be different than in a friendship. But no, I'm not sure that at its core a boundary is any different.
It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
What is and what is not okay in the relationship. Good. So why do you think people struggle to say no? Like I've heard a boundary is we're saying yes to some things and saying no to something else, right? Why do you think we have a hard time saying no, or that we have a hard time setting boundaries? Why do we feel guilty about it?
Great question. I know for myself, I've struggled with saying no for a long time in life, and it's been later in life as well that I've learned that it's okay to say no, right? So sometimes we struggle to say no because of fear of letting people down, right? Or we've had a boundaryless life and have been enmeshed and responsible for managing other people's well-being.
Tell me what you mean by enmeshed.
Enmeshed means there's a lack of boundaries between people, or not enough boundaries. So, a husband and wife can be enmeshed if husband is feeling more responsible for managing wife's needs than is his responsibility, right? Enmeshed is a relationship that is too intertwined, not enough self or individual in the relationship.
Okay. So again, going back to it's a not having clarity about where a person ends and the other begins. It sounds like it's just enmeshed. When I hear that, you had your hands together and saying like, this is, they're kind of, that it's messy where one ends and one begins. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So, when you said you had a hard time saying no, that you've had a hard time. Why would you think that personally you've had a hard time saying no and setting boundaries?
Personally, I grew up in a home where there was enmeshment, and I was responsible for managing parents' emotions.
Or at least you felt like you were responsible.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep, that's how the structure felt in the home. And as such, saying no meant that things would get difficult or more volatile or more frustrating. It was easier to say yes and keep the peace than it was to say no.
So you were really conditioned that saying no actually was problematic to the peace in the home.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then therefore you became a people pleaser, would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you see that a lot in your practice now?
See a lot of what?
Like that inability or difficulty saying no?
For myself or for my clients?
For clients. Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly.
Okay.
I see individuals struggling to say no, and that's where boundaries can be really powerful to help them learn how to say yes and how to say no. If we can't say no, we can't really say yes as well.
If we can't really say no, we can't really say yes.
Right? Because
tell me what you mean by that.
all the yeses aren't authentic. Yes. Right?
Thank you for talking about that, because I think sometimes we say a yes, but we don't really mean it.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to do it, or we don't feel it. So what do we become? We become resentful. We become hateful, and we feel taken advantage of. But again, who is allowing that to happen? We're allowing that to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So we've got to get really clear on what our yeses and our nos are. How do we do that? How do you get really clear, especially when you've maybe been in an environment where you have just learned to say yes because it keeps the peace, and the peace helps you to stay happy and healthy and thriving. So how do you learn what's your yes and what's your nos?
Yeah, so you're hitting on several things there, right? For me, not saying no was protective. So the first thing to be able to say yes or no, and to define that, I needed to get to a space of safety first, right? And then the second thing is we've got to be able to get to know ourselves. As we get to know ourselves, what our values are. And for me, that's how I frame it with boundaries. I need to know my values. When I know my values, then I can know what I want to say yes to and what I want to say no to. I want to say no to reacting in anger, but I want to say yes to listening to my anger and honoring what it needs, right? So I want to say no to binge watching Netflix, right? But I want to say yes to enjoying entertainment. And so knowing my values and then being able to define the yeses and nos as I know myself and my values, and have had the safety or safe space to explore who I am, what's important to me, what my values are, what my priorities are.
I am so appreciative that you talked about values, because I think when we understand our values, we then can understand our yes and nos. And yet understanding values, even as a grown adult, can be really tough.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I've been told what my values are often, right? Either by my parents or my community or my religious community, but really getting clear about, wait, what matters to me? Not what I have been told what matters, but actually what matters to me. And getting really clear about that will help you understand your yes and your no's, right? So that's really, really valuable. And I appreciate that you brought that up, that when we understand that, we can more clearly understand what our yeses and nos are, right? That's really helpful. So what do you think is, how can we recognize when we need a boundary? When maybe we're not living in our values? How do we recognize that?
For me, it's when I notice resentment, frustration, some of those things you mentioned a few minutes ago. When there's resentment and frustration, I know that I have a boundary that I'm not honoring, right? And I might be shifting the blame and blaming someone else, and they're responsible for it, but it's an indication I'm not addressing my boundaries, right? So that's a start. But also then, if we are feeling responsible to manage things that aren't ours to manage, right? If we're feeling consistently overwhelmed in life, those are indicators that there might be a need for boundaries. we might need to be saying no to more responsibilities or to more things than we currently are.
Boy, that's challenging. In our world where sometimes busyness we wear as a badge of honor and accomplishing feels like self-worth, that can be really tricky to do. But when you recognize something's out of whack here, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling resentful, we need to get curious and figure out what is a boundary that I need to put in place, or where is there a boundary violation that's happening? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that takes some introspection. That takes time, right? And introspection. And so how do we go about doing that and understanding what is really going on inside of us?
This is why boundaries are so hard, because oftentimes we recognize we need the boundary right in the moment when we're not as connected with self, we're more reactive, we're more distress, and we're in an argument and we're fighting or whatever, and we're like, that's when we feel the need for the boundary. And so we need to be able to step away from that distressed moment, get out of fight or flight, get out of the limbic system and back into a calm state to figure out, okay, why was that upsetting for me? And doing journaling or talking with a therapist or talking with a trusted friend about why was that distressing? And that distress can teach us about self, so we can slow down and be introspective, learn about our values, our needs there, to then establish an intentional boundary instead of a reactive boundary.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Establishing an intentional boundary rather than a reactive boundary. But that requires time. That requires maybe putting the temperature down, allowing the temperature to go down in the situation, right? And that might mean taking a breath, taking a step away, maybe doing some work around the situation and coming back to it later, right?
Absolutely. It requires time. It requires intentionality. It requires space. It requires safety. Your body, your system needs to feel safe to do that introspection, to learn about self.
Yeah. So when you're saying safety, can you help our listeners to understand what we mean by safety? Because I think when you say the word safety, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, right?
Sure.
In different contexts. So when you say safety, what do you mean by that?
For me, safety means that I am able to be in tune with self. I'm calm, I'm grounded, I'm not facing immediate physical, emotional, financial threats, right? I'm in a space where I know that I'm protected. I know that I'm secure, right? And sometimes we don't find that in our home or in a difficult friendship or in a difficult marriage, right?
Yes.
We sometimes need to create that space of safety for self.
And how do you do that? If you're right, when you were saying maybe growing up, you had to be the people pleaser to keep peace, right?
Yeah.
How does a child find safety when that is their environment? Or, I mean, let's start there.
That's really hard for the child, right? It's not their job to be responsible for their safety at that age.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's really hard for the child.
Yeah.
And being able to cope as best as they can to get through. I mean, and I found safety in other people's homes, right? My grandparents were a safe home. I was like, okay, I could go there and have some safety. But really that safety didn't come until 18, 19, 20, and I started doing my own work and learning how to create that space, that safety, listening to myself, my needs, my values, and having that space to learn that.
Really, that's excellent. That you can find safety in sometimes unconventional ways,